Thank you, Ms. Saunders. As I said earlier, I'm committed to protecting consumers from fraudulent and scam calls, and that's why I, along with Senator Markey, authored the TRACE Act to go after individuals who intentionally violate the law and prey on vulnerable populations. It is unfortunate that illegal robocalls have now increased to the point where people hardly want to pick up their phones at all. Consumers can also be harmed if they do not receive important time-sensitive calls that financial institutions, healthcare companies, and automakers make to their customers. Attorney General Peterson, do you think that you have the necessary tools to meet the challenge of tackling illegal robocallers so that consumers feel it's safe to answer their phone again?
One of the reasons I think the TRACE Act is going to be really advantageous to attorneys general is because technology is a big part of the answer, and I think with the stir-shaken guidelines, that will really help us. I think that's one of the more important elements that we see there, to stay in front of the technology if possible. The other part is the interagency cooperation will be important because I think as states we find more strength in working with the FCC or the FTC in some of these efforts. We've had a history of that, and I think the fact that in the bill it notes that the Attorney General should work with state attorneys general is an important element for us because this thing is always advancing. It's taking turns, and I think working together, we will be strengthened in enforcement.
Direct this to you, Attorney General Peterson, also Mr. Rupi. In the past, when I've asked enforcement and industry officials whether or not the do not call registry is broken, the responses made clear that it is most effective for folks who are making a good faith effort to comply with the law. The reality is that there are too many individuals like Adrian Abramovich who have no regard for the laws on the books, which is why I believe a credible threat of prosecution is necessary for illegal robocalls. Do you agree that threat of criminal prosecution is a necessary deterrent?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question, and it's an excellent question, and I wholeheartedly agree with that view. And I think I applaud the TRACE Act for what it does in establishing that interagency working group to facilitate that type of criminal enforcement. I think one of the things that is not lost on me is that when you look at Mr. Abramovich, he was a recidivist robocaller. So he was sued by AT&T in 2007. He was, the FCC acted aggressively against him in 2017, 2018. The FTC just last week announced a series of settlements with several individuals, Andy Salisbury, Aaron Michael Jones, James Cristiano, and the most disheartening aspect of that announcement was that the FTC referred to them as recidivist robocallers. They're doing this again and again and again, and I think individuals like that definitely need to be targeted through criminal enforcement. The best way to prevent illegal robocalls is to stop them from ever being made, and the best way to ensure that is put the people that are making them behind bars.
I think, Senator Thune, you mentioned in your opening about the cost of doing business, and I think that's a lot of these violators probably perceive it that way. Is if they're fined, they'll move on. I think when you bring up criminal penalties, that's when you get their attention. So that's why I support that.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Rupi, in your testimony, you mentioned industry's commitment to deploying the call authentication framework known as Stir Shake, and it's been discussed quite a bit here this morning already. But the bipartisan TRACE Act will help guide industry on the implementation of this much-needed call framework. Can you speak to how implementation of this framework will help consumers not receive spoofed calls? He's going to describe that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Absolutely. So basically, the way I like to explain the shake and stir standard is as follows. It's obviously a very technologically complex standard and issue. But I think the best way to understand it is that it's effectively the equivalent of a notary public. When you go to a notary public with a document, they don't look at the document. They look at your driver's license and the signature you put on the line. So the stir, shake, and protocols and standards will do two things. Number one, they will authenticate the number that is originating that call. In other words, verifying that that is indeed the number calling. Number two, it will enhance traceback efforts. So when we trace back a call, we may go through 5, 6, 7 different providers to get to the point of origination. Because that call origination will be authenticated at the front end, we can hop right to that point to get to them. And that helps consumers in a couple of ways. Number one, it makes enforcement actions, whether civil or criminal, easier to pursue because we can find these people faster, and U.S. Telecom is, through its traceback group, is doing that. But then number two, the standard will help inform a lot of the analytics that's taking place in the network and on the consumer's end in the various, hundreds of apps and services that are out there. So that will better inform their analytics in terms of how to handle that call. And just to be clear, especially early on, the lack of authentication on a call as the standard is being deployed is not necessarily going to be an indicator of whether that call is good or bad. But as implementation progresses, it will greatly enhance the analytics side for consumers.
Okay. Thank you. Senator Schatz.